Hey guys, Matthew here, and today I'll bring you my video on how to price check items, which I've been talking about for a little bit now. I have a video that was about 2 years ago, which was the exact same, except since then a lot of basically software came out that helps us price check, which is a lot better than what we had access to back then, and also just a lot easier to use. So today I want to focus on basically the one that I use, which is Awakened PoE Trade. There are some other ones which you can use, such as PoE Overlay and other ones that are constantly popping up, but my personal one that I use is Awakened PoE Trade. So I asked my community to send me a few random items that I could go ahead and price check. I asked them to make sure these items were not complete garbage, but also not worth a whole lot. Now, I'm going to go ahead and show you how I would use my macro Awaken PoE Trade to price check these items. I haven't really looked at them, so I'm not sure what to expect, but hopefully they're not all that great and neither all that bad. So, first we have a pair of boots which have a very low amount of life, mana, 10% move speed. Okay, so this is like actually pretty bad, but let's go ahead and imagine that the life was actually 71 and that the move speed was actually 30, and let's go ahead and go with that. So I would go ahead and hit Control Alt D, which would bring up this page on my macro. Pretty much every macro is either Control D or Control Alt D, something like that, which is the generic keys that you need to open up your overlays for certain macros. So the macro is going to basically give you a confidence level of the price it thinks it's worth. Now, I would pretty much honestly trust this about 80% of the time until you get into these bigger ticket items. So, for example, if I was to use the macro on this foil here, which is worth about 50 exalts, or even more technically, and I was to use this, it says that it's worth only 14 to 20, because the macro isn't able to look at very, very, very high-end items because it doesn't have the capability, because there's a lack of actual information and data. As you can see, the confidence levels is only 23%, which is very low. So, going back to these boots here, we said that we were going to imagine that the movement speed was 30 and the life was 70. So, the macro will basically give you an idea of the price that it thinks it's worth depending on the rolls. So, right now, it's not really counting anything in the price. It's just looking at the boots themselves. Now, if we wanted to be a little bit more strict, we can actually go ahead and add in basically every one of these little boxes. We can tick them in, and now afterwards we'll be able to play around with the ranges. So, for example, here, let's say we imagine that it's actually 70 life. So I'm going to go ahead and input 70 life because obviously we don't have 70 life. But if we did have 70 life, it would be 72 or whatever. So we're going to go ahead and take that in. Now you'll see that this says pseudo. So pseudo means essentially that it's accounting for not just the actual life roll, but if there was, say, strength on the boots, which does add life, it would actually count it in. This is a very good thing because a lot of the time I'll have people ask me like, "Oh, I can't find anything similar," because let's say their pair of boots has 80 life and then 50 strength. So they're going to go ahead and look for boots with 80 life and 50 strength. Now the problem that happens is that 50 strength only accounts for what, 12 life or something like that, 15 life, I can't quite remember. So not all that much. So that 80 life only becomes 90. So if instead of using that 50 strength and that 80 life, they used a pseudo of like 90 something life, that would make finding boots that are similar much easier, which is a very, very important thing to learn to use pseudo. And you can do the same thing on the official website. For example, if I was to look at boots again, and I go ahead and type in the life, you'll see that the first thing is always going to be pseudo. So if I look at explicit 70 life, that means that the pair of boots must have 70 life. Now if I look at pseudo, instead, you will see that the 70 life is no longer required. You'll have some boots which have actually less life on them, such as this one, which only has 64 life, but the total life is 84 given the strength, which is very, very important to consider. So, if we actually went through that, and again, imagine that the movement speed is not 70 or 10, but actually 30, we'll go ahead and type in 30. The price macro is going to go ahead and look at what's available on the market with both 30 resistances and 70 life. Now, what else do we have? We have a total of 26 elemental resistances, which is once again very, very low. But let's go ahead and consider the fact that instead of having a resistance of 23, it had 45, which is a tier 2 resistance, or maybe even a tier 1. I can't quite remember. So let's go ahead and type in minimum of 41. Which I like to do, basically, when it comes to pricing items, is I will take the lower number of the given tier to price the item. So if I went back to these boots here, and my pair of boots had, say, let's go ahead and look at non-pseudo life, and let's look at 86 life. So now it's going to show me boots that have, at the very least, 86 life. Now the problem with that is that there might be a pair of boots which is very, very similar to mine, but instead of having 86 life, it has 82 life, which can be divined to 86, given the fact that it's in the same tier. So this is where I would actually use the lowest number of that given tier. So here, the lowest number is 80, because the tier ranges from 80 to 89. So if I was to price check boots like these, I would go ahead and put 80 life instead of 86. The tool will do this automatically for you. So for example, here it said 31 life, despite the fact that maybe our pair of boots had, sorry, it says 31 life here because our pair of boots has 31 life. But before I changed that to 70, it must have said something like 26, because it accounts for the fact that there is a range that actually matters within the tier, or sometimes it might even show you a very high-end number of the tier below, which is also perfectly fine, because people don't tend to divine very low tier items. So now we're left with a pair of boots that should have 70 life, should have 30 move speed, and should have 41 total elemental resistances. Now another thing that this pair of boots has is aspect of the cat. As you can see, it grants level 20 aspect of the cat, 20 being the number that changes, that ranges, except there is no range here, but on the website there is a range. There is no 20, it just says like a little hashtag, given the fact that there's a number here. So the macro automatically downgrades that to 18 to show you guys that, let's say it was 18 to 22 and you had 20, which we do have here, it would take everything within that range. So it helps to price things more effectively. So now we end up with a price which makes a little bit more sense, and that is a little bit less garbage. Now, what we can do, if we want to verify if these prices are right, is go ahead and click at this little trade button, which will open a trade website within our game. This is actually not outside of the game. This is an overlay that is added on top of our game, and where we can see basically all the filters and how it found those prices. So the macro made a filter for us, given the affixes that we asked for it. Basically here, it asked for boots that were non-uniques, that were not corrupted, and they had to have a buyout or a fixed price, which means no unpriced items. It asked for a total of 41 resistance, which I asked here, a total of 70 life, which I asked here, a total of 30 movement speed, which I asked here, and finally the aspect of the cat. As you can see, it even rolled the 18 despite the fact that there is no range, it is always level 20. It also made a count of 1 for any resistances, because it has a total elemental resistances of 26. But personally, I asked for 41. So instead of doing a count of total to each and every one of these and counting one of those, it actually removed that, because I'm not using this here, as you can see. And instead, it gave me the total elemental resistances, which I am using, of 41. Essentially, this filter, or this tool, is making filters for you based on exactly what you're inputting in the mods, which is absolutely amazing. And then it's going to come up with a price and when these were actually listed. So for example, we can see that 13 hours ago there was a pair of boots with 77 life, 30 move speed, double resistances of 20, and aspect of the cat, which was listed for 2 exalts. Now, this pair of boots is probably the one that we are seeing right here, and the listing is, 2x. Meaning, if I had that exact pair of boots, I would probably price it around there. Now, if instead of doing this, what I would have done is taken that same pair of boots and been much more strict with my filters and much more wrong, if you will. I could have taken life instead, put 70 there. Then I could have put movement speed and put like 30 there. Then I could have put my aspect of the cat. And then finally I could have put my fire resistance, I believe I have, and put my 41. And then you'll see that instead of having a 2x pair of boots, we are up to a 4x pair of boots. Now, why is that? And if you were to price your pair of boots for 4 exalts, it would never sell, just like this isn't selling, as you can see 2 days ago. The reason being, well, this actually is worth more given the fact that there is a double resistance on it. But the reason for that is because essentially you are just being way too specific with your filter instead of basically being a lot more broad. So instead of seeing the 2x results, which is actually probably what the boots are worth, you're seeing some 4x results, which are basically, if you were to check that and you'd be like, oh, my boots are worth 4x, right? Then you'd price them at 4x and they would never sell, and you'd be like, why are my boots not selling? So let's go ahead and take another item and do the same thing. So we're going to go ahead and take, I don't know, a weapon. Let's go ahead and take a weapon. So weapons are interesting because there's multiple different types of weapons. There are spellcaster weapons, just as like there's melee weapons. So melee weapons are essentially mostly going to be either physical or elemental based, while caster weapons are going to be based around caster mods, such as fire or damage to spells, spell damage, critical strike chance for spells, percent elemental damage. So like, for example, percent lightning damage, stuff like that. While physical damage weapons are just purely going to be based on physical weapon, and elemental based melee weapons are just going to be based on elemental. Now, this is a little bit wrong with the current meta, which is very heavily around VD. Volatile Dead actually gets just as much damage from flat elemental than from the actual damage to spells, which is kind of an anomaly. Honestly, that isn't the case in 99% of other builds. So let's go ahead and look at my foil, for example, here, and tell you guys how the macro is basically going to go ahead and price this and why it's wrong. So I already said why it's wrong at the beginning. Essentially, there is a lack of very high-end items data. So when it tries to come up with a price, it basically says, I don't know what the fuck this is worth. There's nothing to compare it to, right? And the reason for that is because there's only maybe a handful of foils that actually have 580 DPS on the market, hence why the confidence level is so low. Now, how to actually go ahead and price a foil or pretty much any physical based weapon, such as let's say an axe, a foil, a physical based wand, stuff like that, you're going to look at basically the physical damage range, which is on here it's 205 to 370. Now, when it comes to finding the DPS of the weapon, essentially the DPS of the weapon is going to be the lesser of the range plus the high end of the range divided by 2 times the attack speed. So here it would be 205 plus 370 divided by 2 times 203, and that would give you your DPS, which doesn't account for critical strike chance or weapon range or multiplier or anything like that. It only accounts for basically physical damage and attack speed. That's all that matters, and obviously quality, because quality increases the actual physical damage from it. So if I was to look at this, this is essentially what the macro does for me. So it goes ahead and takes the lower end plus the higher end divided by 2 times the attack speed, and we end up with our basically PDPS, or sorry, basically physical DPS. That is that number, and then we can go ahead and put in the attack speed. So for example, here we have 2.03, which you can see the macro is going to look for 1.82 and no high end to that, but it does put a low end. So let's say there's a foil that has 585 DPS, but it has 1.95 attack speed. It's still going to count for it, and it's still going to give me the price for it, because even if mine is over 2.0 attack speed, that doesn't mean that anything below that, even if it's very, very close, is absolutely worthless. So it is a very good thing to have a macro like this. Now, of course, the crit chance does the same. We have 6.65, and it's going to account for anything over 5.98. And then we have the multiplier. The multiplier says pseudo because essentially it's basically a total, meaning it can actually be accounted for as a multiple or as a mod by itself, or in this case, the implicit, because it is a jeweled foil, meaning the implicit is critical strike multiplier, which is why it's accounted for that. Now, if you were to put in that mod in the tag, it's going to look for basically jeweled foils, but also for any weapon or one-handed sword that also has at least 25 critical, or well, 22 critical strike multiplier, which is basically going to help give you a more accurate price, because you could have a non-jeweled foil but that rolled a very high critical strike multiplier roll be worth more than your foil, but if you're not accounting for it and just looking at jeweled foil, you might be wondering, why is my foil not selling? Well, maybe there's some swords that are not foils that are selling because they're just outright better, but they're on another base, which is always possible and something you need to account for. Then we have the bleeding mods, which we don't care because critical strike builds typically are not bleed builds, and bleed builds typically don't scale critical strike. Therefore, we don't look for critical strike, or sorry, we don't look for bleeding on a foil because those things don't go well together. And then we do have the quality, which again we won't really look for because the quality is accounted for in the DPS. So there's no reason for me to look at the quality being the crafted quality being there, because there could be a foil with no crafted quality, but that just has better affixes, and that is still going to reach higher than 584. So I would look at just the crit chance, the multi, the attack speed per second, and finally the physical DPS. And now I could go ahead and open that, and it's going to give me much more accurate prices. So as you can see, there is 525 for 20 exalts. There is 30 exalts, 537, 33 exalt, 532, and so on and so on. And there's just going to be more basically results that make sense. Now, I don't know what's going on, but for some reason mine are appearing offline, which is quite strange. Maybe it's because I'm in D&D. I'm not 100% sure. Actually, that's probably why that is. Anyways, and let's finish it off with another weapon. Why not? And let's talk about basically these weirdo weapons that are kind of meta this league, which are basically going to be a hybrid of damage to spells and also flat damage, because that is not something that is normal, at least historically speaking anyways. So I'll go ahead and let the macro do its thing. The macro is going to come up with an average of what it thinks it's worth. It thinks it's worth about 4 to 6 exalts with a confidence level of 55, meaning quite likely that is actually not quite correct. So again, we're going to want to be using these pseudo mods. So there is going to be the DPS here, which is based on the fact that this wand is an imbued wand, and it just so happens to have basically fire damage. The DPS, as you can see, if I press this, is not physical DPS, it is elemental DPS. The DPS, though, actually accounts for both physical and elemental DPS put together, which we don't actually want because physical does not scale what we are playing here, which is Volatile Dead. Meaning it is sometimes important to know what your item is made for to know how to price it. So we know that elemental damage is over 200. We are going to let the macro do its thing when it comes to the attack speed, because attack speed is quite important. We are also going to let the macro do its thing when it comes to critical strike chance, which is based on the base that we're using here. That being said, I don't know if Volatile Dead crits, so maybe I won't actually put in the critical strike chance because I don't know if it's actually necessary to the build. I think they go elemental overload, meaning they crit, but they don't care about critical strike multiplier. So I'm not going to put in the critical strike multiplier. The lightning damage here is quite low, so I'm not going to count for that either. The spell damage is quite low. It is mostly coming from the fact that it is a wand, therefore there is a spell damage implicit. So that's that, and then we are going to have our lightning damage to spells. Better than this, you'll see once I go ahead and price check this. And we're also going to put trigger. The reason why I'm putting trigger in this specific search is because trigger is very, very important to that build. And also because the fact that there is trigger means there is an open suffix. So what I could do instead, when I open up this trade to see, similar-ish wands, you'll see that I have Essence here with Electrocuting, which is basically a similar wand. The difference here is that, as you can see, since I'm asking for lightning damage to spells, I'm actually cucking myself a little bit here, and I believe there is a total for damage to spells. I'm not 100% sure, but yes, there is a total which you can actually change, which I don't know why the macro isn't doing, or maybe I just didn't realize it. No, I'm not seeing it. But let's say you're trying to price your wand and you have lightning damage to spells. In this case, he has 66 to 66. I mean, that seems like a bug. But the average being 59, I can actually put elemental damage to spells. So maybe somebody else has a fire damage to spell wand or a cold damage to spells. Who knows? And I do want to take that in consideration because fire damage is just as good as lightning. So we're going to actually take that in consideration. Now, if we check out everything else, it's taken in consideration the attack speed, the elemental damage, which is purely based on the flat elemental damage, which is the fire damage from the essence modifier. It is non-corrupted. There is an actual fixed price. If I look at this here, you'll see that there is fire damage and local fire damage, and it's asking for either one of those. Now, the macro actually said no to this, and the reason why it said no to that is because I turned off the DPS, and what I did is instead is I put on a total of elemental DPS. So it stops looking for particularly fire, and it just starts looking for 180 elemental DPS, and it does the same thing. It stops looking for accuracy because I did not put in accuracy in the search. So now I'll end up with the spell damage from the implicit, most likely, my elemental damage to spells, and my trigger on an attack speed one and flat elemental damage. Now if I go ahead and check this, you'll see that instead of having purely fire modifiers, we might have something else. It doesn't seem that way, but that is probably mostly because these are all essence crafted, and the fact that they are essence crafted kind of pushes the elemental DPS higher than, let's say, a T1 roll. But you know, maybe somewhere down the road we would be able to find a non-fire one, because there's nothing that tells the filter to be purely based on fire, and there's also nothing that tells the filter to be stuck on elemental damage to spells as lightning. It could be cold, it could be anything else. Now, of course, these are all pretty much crafted the same way, meaning you're pretty much always going to be fire and lightning, but that is not based on the filter. That is just based on what's available. Now, maybe if I look at any, I'll find some different results, but maybe they're all going to be fire and lightning, which would make perfect sense because that's what people care for in this specific build. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is, really quickly, is also wands, and that is basically going to be plus level of socketed, plus level of gem wands. So let's say I was talking about a minion wand here. So I would be crafting a minion wand which has, say, level of all minion skill gems, and then level of all spells skill gem, right? If I look at this, you'll see wands with both of them. Now the thing is, maybe I craft the wand and I don't actually get both of them. Maybe I only have one of them. So that is something that is very important for some, especially with items that have level of, you know, gems. So for example, you could have a wand that has +1 level of lightning gems, very high lightning damage to spells, and then very high % spell damage, which would make a very good wand. But if you were to price check it, you might be like, oh, there's nothing that exists that is quite like it. But you just might be wrong on that. And the thing that's happening is that you're being too strict in your filter. The fact that you have one that has +1 to all lightning gems does not mean that there are nothing else that is basically equal to it, such as in this case, which would be +1 to all spells. So let's go ahead and run that just real quick. So for example, I have +1 to all spells, +1 to all lightning. I'm going to go ahead and look that up. You'll see a bunch of different wands come up. Now let's say I also had spell damage, and let's say it's quite high, it's like 60, and then I also have lightning damage to spells, and let's say it's like 70 or something, I don't know. You'll see that this doesn't exist. Now, obviously, this doesn't exist because these are all prefixes, and there's no way your item has 4 prefixes. So maybe you have a +1 lightning, and then the spell damage, and then the lightning. Now, let's put this higher because there is an implicit. Maybe this is too high. I'm not sure. I haven't really made any filters for those. All right, there we go. So we've got one here with T2 spell damage, T3 lightning damage to spells, and +1 all. Now you might look at this and be like, oh, this is worth 12 exalts. My one is worth 12 exalt. But the reality is maybe there's a wand which is just as good, but instead of having the lightning, it has the all spells. And you'll see in this case, it doesn't exist. But how you would remediate to this situation is basically making a group of count and then going ahead and putting in a count of 1 and adding in those two things. So all lightning and all spells. In this case, it's going to go ahead and find that one wand, but it's also going to find other ones. Like for example, we went from 12 exalts with this one, right, which had +1 lightning, which looks like it was insane. But then if you look at this one, it also has +1 lightning. And it's only like 1 exalt, but maybe we can find one that actually has all spells. Let's see. So this one here actually is all spells and is only 130C. So what do you want to be buying? Or what do you want to be? What do you want your price tag to be? Do you want to price it at 12 exalts or do you want to price it at 130C? The reality is, chances are, it's much more likely to sell at 130C. Now, I just realized that this is actually a staff, therefore that 130C price tag is absolute bullshit. But if it wasn't a staff and it was actually a wand, it's definitely something to consider. The fact that you need, when you're pricing an item, to consider for basically the multiple different outcomes that actually amount to the same amount of either damage or, affix total, which is very, very important. So on that note, though, I'm going to end this video by saying a huge thank you to my supporters: Gikona, KFish, Zachary, Luro, Scott, Casticus, Minicel, Ramazan, MrCoffee, Minor, and Christian, as well as anybody else who wishes to remain anonymous and anybody else who supports me on different platforms. Hopefully this video helps you out if you're having issues pricing your items. Just essentially keep in mind that there are more than one multiplier or modifier in most cases that will give you the same result. And if you aren't taking every single one of those into consideration, especially with totals and count mods, you will end up more than likely not finding anything remotely close to your item and being like, wow, this is an insane item, while in reality it might not be all that insane. You're just being too specific with your filters. Now, hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you learned a little something, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.